The summer of 1992 on a 240-acre farm 9 miles south of Plainview, Texas. A 38-year-old woman named Phyllis Granger walked out to the back 40 acres her husband had planted in cotton for 11 consecutive years and started counting rows with a carpenter's tape measure and a spool of orange flagging ribbon she had bought at the hardware store in town for $1.899. She measured 12 rows of cotton. Then she pushed a wire flag into the dry panhandle soil. She measured 12 more rows. She pushed another flag. She did this from the southern fence line to the north windbreak in the heat of a July afternoon, while her 16-year-old son, Aaron, watched from the cab of the pickup truck with the air conditioning running, and her hired hand, a leathered West Texas man named Oscar Timmons, who had worked the Granger place since before her husband, Ray, had taken it over from his father, stood at the edge of the field with his arms folded and his hat pulled low and did not say a word. By the end of that afternoon, there were 63 orange flags in a grid across the back 40, arranged in 6 north-south lines. By the following week, Oscar had dug the holes. By the end of August, in those holes, Phyllis had planted 63 grafted pecan saplings. 3-year rootstock she had hauled herself in the bed of the farm truck from a nursery in Comanche, Texas. 210 miles round trip at $14 a tree. Cotton had grown on that ground for 30 years. The flags went in and then the trees went in, and in Hale County in 1992, there was no faster way to start a conversation at the feed store on Broadway Street than to have done what Phyllis Granger had done. Oscar Timmons was 64 years old. He had grown up in the caprock country of the Panhandle, had worked cotton and sorghum since he was 9 years old, walking behind his father on a rented farm outside Floydada, and had hired on with Ray's father in 1961 because it was the best-paying steady work in the county. He had stayed through 30 years of drought and 2 hailstorms and 1 tornado that took the equipment barn and 3 weeks of his wages. He had taught Ray how to irrigate the Ogallala draws in 1974. He had sat in the waiting room at the hospital in Lubbock when Aaron was born. He had helped carry Ray's casket in March of 1991. Mrs. Granger, Oscar said the afternoon she drove the first flag into the ground, and then he stopped and looked at the flag and looked at her. Go ahead, Oscar. Ray never put trees in this field. I know he didn't. Cotton's what this ground is for, always been cotton back here. Cotton's what Ray put it in. That's not the same thing. Oscar took off his hat and held it in both hands and looked across the 40 acres of flat panhandle hardpan that he had irrigated and sprayed and chopped for 3 decades. The soil was pale and cracked in July. It was always cracked in July. People are going to say things, he said. People already are. They're going to say more once those trees go in. Let them. Oscar put his hat back on. He looked at the flags. He had not yet asked the question that mattered, and Phyllis had not volunteered the answer, and they both understood that was how it would go for now. Mrs. Granger, may I ask what you expect to get out of 63 pecan trees in a cotton field? Ask me again in 8 years. By September, the word had moved through Hale County the way word moved through flat West Texas farm country, which was with the speed of boredom and the permanence of drought. The Groover brothers, who farmed 4 sections of continuous cotton 3 miles east, heard it from their fuel supplier. The fuel supplier had heard it from Oscar's cousin, who worked at the co-op gin. By the time the Plainview Daily Herald's agricultural reporter mentioned it in passing at the Chamber of Commerce breakfast in October, every serious farmer in Hale County, and most of the ones in Floyd and Swisher, had heard that the Granger widow had put pecan trees in her back cotton field. Pecan trees in her cotton field. There was a way people said it that contained an entire judgment. The tone said she was grieving wrong and farming wrong, and that both problems would eventually resolve themselves at the bank's expense, and that the land would pass to someone who understood what panhandle hardpan was for. 5 people in particular decided something needed to be done. The first was Gerald Mabry, who held the operating note at First National Bank of Plainview. Gerald was 56, a third-generation Plainview banker whose grandfather had financed cotton gins and whose father had financed center-pivot irrigation systems across the Ogallala aquifer country, and who understood farming the way bankers understand farming, which is as a set of ratios: yield per acre, input cost, commodity price, risk profile. He had extended Ray Granger credit for 11 years. He had liked Ray. He did not like anomalies. 63 pecan trees in a cotton field was an anomaly, and anomalies, in Gerald Mabry's experience, tended to become non-performing assets. Gerald did not call Phyllis. He called her brother-in-law, Pete Granger, who farmed 3 sections of cotton 12 miles north, and suggested that the family might want to have a conversation with her about the practical realities of orchard agriculture in the southern high plains. The second was Leland Pruitt, who ran the Farm Bureau office in Hale County and who had been writing the county's crop insurance policies for 22 years. Leland was 50, a man who understood agricultural risk the way actuaries understand risk, which was as a thing that deviated from a mean. Continuous cotton on irrigated panhandle ground had a mean he could price. Pecan trees intercropped with cotton had no mean he could price, because nobody in Hale County had ever done it. His concern was not personal. He told himself that twice a day. The third was Bobby Treadwell, who sold John Deere equipment out of a dealership on the south edge of Plainview. Bobby was 48. He had sold Ray Granger a 77 280 combine and 2 planters and a chisel plow over 15 years, and he had liked the Granger operation because it fit the pattern of operations he understood. A farm that planted pecans in its cotton field was a farm that was about to need different equipment than Bobby Treadwell sold. Different equipment and different suppliers, and a different relationship with the county's agricultural infrastructure. Bobby was not opposed to Phyllis Granger personally. He was opposed to the disruption. The fourth was her brother-in-law, Pete Granger. Pete was 52, Ray's older brother, a careful man with 900 acres of continuous cotton who had expected, when their father died in 1988, to absorb the Granger home place into his own operation eventually. He had not said this to Ray. He had not said it to Phyllis after Ray died. He had said it to himself in the way people say things they know they should not say out loud. When Gerald Mabry called him about the pecan trees, Pete drove over without calling ahead and sat at Phyllis's kitchen table for 40 minutes. He said the trees were an experiment that could cost her the place. He said it 3 times. Phyllis listened to all 3 repetitions and then said that she appreciated his concern and that she would see him at church on Sunday. Pete left. He did not stop worrying. He did not stop considering what he would do with the home place if the bank took it. The fifth was Reva Hutchins, who had been Phyllis's neighbor to the east for 30 years, who had watched Ray and Phyllis build the operation from a young couple's first planting, and who now sat on the board of the Hale County Groundwater Conservation District. Reva was 63, a cotton and sorghum farmer with 480 acres of her own, and she believed with the conviction of a woman who had survived the 1980s farm crisis that any deviation from proven panhandle crops was a form of financial recklessness. She had watched 6 farming families lose their land in the 80s to experiments that had seemed sensible in extension office pamphlets, and had not survived contact with a panhandle summer. She was not Phyllis's enemy. She was something harder to handle than an enemy. She was a friend who was certain she was right. Bobby Treadwell mentioned the trees to Leland Pruitt at a Rotary lunch in January of 1993. Leland mentioned them to Gerald Mabry at the bank. Gerald mentioned them to Pete at a seed meeting in February. By spring, all 5 of them had discussed Phyllis Granger in terms that would have surprised her and would not have surprised her at all. Now let me tell you about Phyllis Granger, because what she did on that back 40 over the following decade only makes sense if you know who she was before Ray got sick and who she had been thinking about becoming while she was running the farm alone in the last year of his life. Phyllis was born Phyllis Ann Castellano in 1954 in Roswell, New Mexico, the second of 4 children of a family that had come up from Chihuahua in 1940. Her father, Ernesto Castellano, ran what the Anglos in Chaves County called a truck farm, which was a polite term for the kind of intensive mixed crop operation that fed families who could not afford to specialize. He grew chilies, squash, corn, beans, onions, and along the south fence a line of 30 pecan trees that his own father had planted in 1938, because pecans were the one thing in New Mexico you planted for your children and not for yourself. Ernesto Castellano did not explain what he was doing when he farmed. He demonstrated it. He showed Phyllis at age 7 how to read the soil moisture by pushing a stick into the ground and pulling it out and looking at the color of the dirt at different depths. He showed her at age 10 how the pecan roots, by the time they were 15 years old, or pulling water from 30 feet down during drought years and making it available to the shallower crops through capillary exchange in the soil. He did not use those words. He said, "The trees are drinking for everybody when there is nothing left in the top ground." He said it standing at the south fence in August of 1964, when the rest of the vegetable crops had gone pale and the pecans were still dark green. She had wanted to study soil science at New Mexico State. The money ran out after her brother's tuition. She went to work instead, first in a Roswell diner, then as a bookkeeper for a farm supply company in Clovis, where she met Ray Granger at a rodeo in 1975. He was 28, a West Texas cotton farmer with 240 acres and a 1971 Ford pickup, and a manner that was straightforward in a way that Phyllis, who had grown up around careful people, recognized as genuine. They married in 1976. She moved to Plainview. The years between 1976 and 1991 were the years of building. Ray ran the cotton, Phyllis kept the books, raised Aaron, managed the household operation, and planted a kitchen garden behind the house that grew larger every year until it was half an acre of vegetables, herbs, and a small nursery of seedlings she sold at the Plainview Farmers Market on Saturday mornings. She knew things about soil that the Panhandle extension agents did not know because she had learned them from a man who had learned them from a man who had grown pecans on desert hardpan in 1938. Ray began losing weight in the fall of 1989. By the spring of 1990, the doctors in Lubbock had a name for what was happening. By the winter of 1990, they had a timeline. He died in March of 1999. Phyllis was 37 years old, with a 15-year-old son, 240 acres of cotton ground, an operating note at First National for $31,000, and a grief that she was not going to have the luxury of sitting inside for long. She paid the operating note in November of 1991 from the cotton harvest. She spent that winter going through every note her father had ever written in the margins of the seed catalogs he mailed to her. She went through the soil survey maps the USDA had published for Hale County. She read the extension bulletins from Texas A&M on pecan production in the southern high plains, the ones that said pecans were possible on deep sandy loam with supplemental irrigation. And she wrote letters to 3 researchers whose names were on the footnotes of those bulletins and received 2 replies with attached papers. She had her father's words about the south fence pecans in her head every night that winter. By March of 1992, she had decided the back 40 was going to grow 2 things. Here is what she knew that nobody at the feed store on Broadway knew. She knew that mature pecan trees on the southern high plains could reach a taproot depth of 40 feet by year 10, pulling water from the lower Ogallala formations that cotton roots at 18 inches could never access. She knew that in a drought year, the deep-rooted trees functioned as a hydraulic lift, moving water upward through the soil profile in a process that benefited the shallower-rooted cotton in the alleys between rows. She knew that pecan trees reached commercial production in year 7 or 8 on good rootstock. She knew that the market price for native pecans in Texas had averaged $1.10 a pound for the previous 6 years, and that a mature panhandle pecan tree on irrigated ground could produce 40 to 60 pounds in a good year. She knew that 63 trees at 50 pounds each at $1 a pound was $3,150 a year, on top of whatever the cotton in the alleys produced. She had a folder of papers. She had not shown it to anyone. The first summer was quiet. The cotton went in around the saplings in May. The trees grew slowly in the panhandle heat, as pecan trees do in their first years, building root systems downward instead of branches upward. Oscar watered them twice a week from the farm's irrigation system, a separate drop line he had rigged from the center pivot main line at Phyllis's instruction. He did not tell her she was wasting water. He watched the trees and said nothing and watered them on the days she told him to water them. The cotton yield that fall came in at 620 pounds of lint per acre on the back, 40, down 18 pounds from the previous year. Phyllis wrote the number in her ledger and wrote the words root competition, year 1, expected beside it, and went on. The men at the feed store had little to say yet. The trees were in. They were small. The cotton had still come in. They waited, as communities wait in small flat towns, for the vindication they were certain was coming. Gerald Mabry called Phyllis in February of 1993 and asked her to come to the bank. She came. She brought 3 years of operating ledgers. She brought a typed summary of the pecan planting schedule and a projected income table for years, 1 through 10. She placed the projection on his desk. He looked at it for a moment. "Mrs. Granger, the bank has been patient with the transition since Ray passed. We want to see the operation succeed." "Then you know it is succeeding." The note was paid in full in November. The yield on the back 40 was within 20 pounds of the 5-year average. The trees are in the ground. They are not a liability. They are a long-term asset that the bank's ledger does not yet have a column for. Gerald leaned back. He had done this with widows before. He had done it with young men who had inherited farms and had ideas. The lean back was a technique. It said, "I have seen this go wrong, and I am watching for the signs." Phyllis did not move. She had watched her father negotiate with Anglo suppliers in Roswell for 20 years. She knew what the lean back meant, and she knew how to wait it out. Gerald approved the note. He had approved it before she walked in. The meeting had been about something other than the note. He drove home that evening and told his wife that the Granger widow was going to be a problem for the bank within 4 years. He said it to close the subject. The subject was not closed. The second year, the trees grew 14 inches and began to show their first structural branches. Oscar, who had never in 64 years of West Texas farming touched a pecan tree that was not wild and roadside, watched Phyllis prune the lower scaffolds one February morning with a pair of loppers she had brought from home. He watched her work through a row in 2 hours. By the afternoon, he was asking her what she was looking for in each cut. She explained the scaffold system, the central leader, the reason you remove downward angling growth in the first 3 years. Oscar listened without comment. The following February, he pruned half the trees himself while she took Aaron to a college visit in Lubbock. By the second pruning season, Oscar Timmons was the second person in Hale County who knew how to form a young Wichita pecan variety from rootstock. Leland Pruitt refused to write a crop insurance policy for the pecan portion of the back 40 in 1994. He cited insufficient actuarial data for intercropped orchards in the southern High Plains. He was not wrong about the data. The data did not exist because nobody had done this before. Phyllis noted the date and the reason in her ledger, accepted the coverage gap, and increased her contingency reserve. She did not appeal. She filed the correspondence in a folder she labeled Record. Reve Hutchins came to call in the spring of 1994. She came on a Thursday afternoon, which was the day Reva always made social calls, and she accepted iced tea at the kitchen table, and she asked about Aaron, who was a junior in high school, and about the market garden, and then she worked her way around to the back 40. "Phyllis, some of us have been talking." "I know you have, Rifa." "We're worried. The back 40, that's your best irrigated ground. If the trees take over and the cotton drops out, you're looking at a 10-year gap before the pecans pay anything meaningful. The trees will begin producing in year 7. That's 1999. The cotton in the alleys is running within 12% of full field yield. The gap is not what you're imagining." Riva was quiet for a moment. She had expected softness. She had known Phyllis for nearly 20 years and had watched her absorb Ray's death with a composure that had seemed fragile, and she had expected the softness to be here in the kitchen, available. "You sound very certain," Riva said. "I am not certain about the weather. I am certain about the trees." Riva did not have a follow-up. She stayed another 20 minutes and asked about the garden and left. She did not stop talking to the others, but she talked with a little less certainty after that afternoon, because she had sat across the table from Phyllis Granger, and Phyllis Granger had not looked like a woman making a mistake. The years 1994 and 1995 were the years the trees began to show what they would become. The canopies opened. The root systems went deep. Oscar stopped treating them as an experiment and started treating them as a section of the farm that required its own schedule and its own maintenance logic. He never said this to Phyllis. She never pointed it out. It was simply a thing that happened between two people who worked the same ground. Bobby Treadwell noticed something in the fall of 1995. He had watched Phyllis pull into the dealership twice for parts, and both times she had paid cash and had asked specific questions about hydraulic fittings and PTO ratings that told him she knew exactly what she was doing. He had also noticed, in the spring of 1995, that she had not come to him for a replacement planter. She had bought a used one from a dealer in Lubbock that was configured for the wider row spacing the pecan alleys required. She had not asked his advice. She had not needed to. Bobby stood at his desk for a long time after he figured that out. He was not yet on her side. He was no longer fully on the side of the men he had lunch with on Tuesdays. The drought of 1996 was not the worst drought in Panhandle history, but it was the worst since 1980, and in a county that ran its agriculture on the Ogallala Aquifer, any drought that lasted more than 14 months was a crisis. By July of 1996, the water table under the surrounding farms had dropped 8 feet. The center pivot systems were pumping harder and producing less pressure. The cotton on Pete Granger's 900 acres to the north came in at 480 pounds of lint, down nearly a third from his 5-year average. Leland Pruitt processed 11 crop insurance claims in Hale County that fall. Gerald Mabry restructured 4 operating notes. The back 40 on the Granger home place came in at 590 pounds of lint. The pecan trees, which had been running their taproots downward for 4 years, were accessing water at a depth the cotton roots on the neighboring farms could not reach. The alley cotton was drawing on a moisture profile that the trees had been improving through root activity and organic matter since 1992. This was not luck. It was what her father had said at the South Fence in 1964, in words she had carried for 32 years. The pecans did not produce commercially in 1996. They were 4 years old, but they had kept the cotton alive at a yield level that put the Granger back 40 in the top quarter of dry land and irrigated performance in the county that year, and Phyllis paid her operating note in full in November of 1996, while 4 of her neighbors carried balances forward at interest. Gerald Mabry heard the yield numbers from his loan officer in December. He did not call Phyllis. He sat with the numbers for 3 days, then he pulled out the projection she had placed on his desk in 1993. The one he had glanced at and set aside, and he read it for the first time. The first commercial pecan harvest came in the fall of 1999. Phyllis picked 140 pounds of Wichita variety pecans off the back 40 with a shaker rented from a contractor in Lubbock and Aaron home from Texas Tech for a long weekend, and Oscar, 69 years old and moving slower, driving the pickup between the rows. She sold through 3 channels, half to a shelling operation in San Saba, a quarter at her farmer's market stand, bagged in 1-pound bags with a handwritten price of $3.50. The rest she used for the pecan butter and the praline pecans she had been selling at the Plainview Farmers Market for 2 years already. The net income from pecans in 1999 was $4,200. The cotton in the alleys came in at 610 pounds. The combined gross on the back 40 was the highest any 40 acres in the county had produced that year. She did not tell anyone the number. She wrote it in her ledger, and she went to bed. Then the bad year came, as bad years do on the high plains, without warning and without apology. In the spring of 2001, Oscar Timmons drove the ATV into a low terrace near the south windbreak at dusk and rolled it. He was 71. He broke his collarbone and 2 ribs. The ambulance came. He was at the Regional Medical Center in Lubbock for 9 days. Phyllis drove to Lubbock 4 times. Aaron drove down from Amarillo, where he was working in agricultural sales, twice. Oscar came home to his house at the end of the lane and sat on the porch and was not able to lift anything or drive anything for 10 weeks. Phyllis hired no one. She ran the farm. She was 47 years old, and she ran 240 acres of cotton and 40 acres of orchard intercrop and a market garden through the worst 10 weeks of the planting season without stopping. She was in the fields at 5:30 every morning. She was in the farm's office doing books and correspondence until 10 every night. She lost 12 pounds she did not have to lose. In the 5th week, the irrigation pump on the east pivot failed. The repair required a part from a supplier in Amarillo and a 2-day wait. 2 days without irrigation in a Panhandle May on cotton in early vegetative stage. She managed it. She called in every favor she had with the pump contractor. She rerouted water from the north pivot at reduced pressure. She did not lose the stand. Bobby Treadwell heard about the pump failure on the 3rd day. He had a used pump motor in his shop, a floor model he had taken as a trade-in from a farm equipment auction, which did not fit the Granger system exactly but could be adapted. He called the Amarillo supplier and found out the wait had extended to 5 days. He drove out to the farm without calling ahead. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon with the used motor in the back of his service truck and his mechanic beside him. Phyllis was in the pump house when he pulled in. She looked at him. She looked at the motor. "Bobby." "Mrs. Granger, I heard about the pump. I've got a Berkeley that'll fit your mounting plate with one modified flange. Gary can have it running in 3 hours. She looked at him for a moment. "What do I owe you?" "Nothing until fall. If it doesn't solve the problem, you don't owe anything." She let him in. Gary had the motor running in 2.5 hours. Bobby did not stay. He walked back to his truck, and then he stopped and turned around. "Mrs. Granger, I should have said something to you 9 years ago instead of what I didn't say. You came now, Bobby. The cotton is alive." He nodded. He drove back to the dealership and did not mention the motor to the men he lunched with on Tuesdays. They found out anyway because Gary told his wife, and his wife was in the same Sunday school class as Leland Pruitt's wife, and Leland mentioned it at the feed store the following week with a tone that was not quite what he intended, because the tone came out sounding like respect. The 2002 growing season was the one that settled the question permanently in Hale County. The drought that arrived in the spring of 2002 was the kind of drought that old men compared to the 1950s, 14 months of below-normal precipitation. The Ogallala dropped 12 feet in some monitoring wells by August. The county average for cotton lint came in at 390 pounds per acre. Pete Granger, 4 miles north, harvested 340 pounds and carried $28,000 forward at 9.5% interest. Leland Pruitt's insurance office filed more Hale County crop claims in 2002 than in any year since 1980. The back 40 on the Granger home place came in at 530 pounds of cotton lint. The pecan trees, 10 years old, reached 42 feet of taproot depth that summer. The hydraulic lift was working at full capacity. The moisture profile in the alley soil was measurably different from the soil in the open cotton fields on every neighboring farm. Phyllis had not known, when she planted in 1992, that there would be a drought in 2002. She had known that there would be a drought sometime. On the high plains, there was always a drought sometime. On the high plains, there was always a drought sometime. She had planted for the drought she did not know the date of. The pecan harvest in 2002 was 2,640 pounds. The market had moved. Phyllis sold pecans that fall at $4.20 a pound wholesale. The income from pecans was $11,088. The combined gross from the back 40 was $34,600 against a county average row crop gross of $9,200 that year. She paid the operating note in November. She paid it in full. She put $18,000 into a savings account in Lubbock. The men at the feed store on Broadway Street stopped making the joke that had been going around since 1992. It had been a small joke, not a mean one. Just the kind of joke that flat country people make about the one farmer who does something different. It stopped in the winter of 2002, the same way the joke about Corey Whitlock had stopped in Iowa in 1989, which was quietly and without ceremony because there was no longer anything funny about it. The Lubbock Avalanche Journal sent a reporter named Grace Odom out to the farm in the spring of 2003. Grace was 26 and had been covering agriculture for 2 years and had been told by her editor to look into the Granger pecan operation as a drought year anomaly story. She arrived expecting an eccentric. She left with 4 pages of notes and a quote she would use as her lead. "Why did you plant the trees?" "Because my father showed me at the south fence in 1964 that when the water is gone from the top ground, the deep roots are still drinking. I just gave the cotton some trees to drink with." The story ran on the front page of the agriculture section on April 9, 2003. It was reprinted in the Texas Farm Bureau publication in May. By October, Phyllis had received 61 letters from farmers across the southern plains asking about the intercrop system. She answered everyone on her laptop at the kitchen table in the evenings. Pete Granger came to see her in December of 2003. He drove himself. He came alone. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he had sat in 1992, and told her 3 times that the trees would cost her the place. He could not look at her at first. "Phyllis," he said. "Pete, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it as family, not as anything else." "All right. I was wrong in 1992. I was wrong about the trees, and I was wrong about other things." He stopped. I came to you after Ray's funeral and said what I said about the land, about Whitlock hands." He shook his head. "I should not have said that." Phyllis was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands on the table. "Ray knew you loved this land," she said. "He also knew it was my land and Aaron's land. You knew that too. You just forgot it for a minute." Pete nodded. He looked at the window. It was December and the panhandle was pale and empty outside the glass. "The bank's got me in a restructure," he said. "I've been carrying forward 2 years now." "I know." "I'm not asking for anything, Phyllis. I want you to know that. I came to say what I should have said a long time ago." "I know you're not asking." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to put something to you anyway. Aaron and I have been talking. We've been thinking about the north section and whether the Pecan system would work up there. It would work better with your east field buffer if you're in it. I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a partnership on a system that works, with a man who knows this ground and who is Ray's brother." Pete looked at her. "Why?" "Because Ray would have wanted his brother's land kept whole, and because I don't believe in neighbors who don't make it." They signed a management agreement with an agricultural attorney in Lubbock in February of 2004. Pete Granger began transitioning 40 acres of his east field to a modified pecan intercrop system that spring. Oscar Timmons, 74 years old and slower than he had been, drove out to Pete's east field twice that summer to walk the rows with Pete and show him what Phyllis had showed Oscar, which was what Ernesto Castellano had shown Phyllis at the South Fence in Roswell in 1964. The Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service invited Phyllis to speak at the annual Dryland and Limited Irrigation Agriculture Conference in Lubbock in 2010. She was 56. She had not spoken publicly since the Grace Odom interview in 2003. She almost declined. Aaron, who was managing the farm's expansion by then, convinced her to go. She stood at a podium in a conference room at the Lubbock Civic Center with a single note card. She looked at the card and put it in her jacket pocket. "People ask me why I'd put pecan trees in a cotton field in 1992. The honest answer is that my father put them in my head in 1964 when I was 10 years old standing at a fence in New Mexico. The real question is why we stopped mixing crops in the first place. The answer is that mixed crop farming is hard to finance and hard to insure and hard to explain to a bank examiner. So between 1940 and 1980 we simplified the farm until it fit the loan form. Then we forgot we had simplified it and started calling the simplified version natural. It is not natural. It is a financial product. The land does not naturally grow one thing. The Ogallala does not naturally serve one root depth. Every acre you commit to a single crop is an acre that is refusing help from everything else that could grow there." She paused. "In 2002, the county averaged 390 pounds of lint. My back 40 averaged 530. That was not luck. That was 10 years of taproot doing what taproot does when you let it grow where it needs to grow. The trees were drinking for the cotton. My father said that when I was 10, it took me until I was 38 to put it in the ground." She stepped back. The room was quiet for a moment, then it was not. Oscar Timmons was not in the audience. He had died in 2007, peacefully, at his house at the end of the lane. Phyllis and Aaron and Oscar's daughter from Lubbock were the only ones at the small funeral. He was buried in the Methodist Cemetery in Petersburg. Bobby Treadwell was in the audience. He was 66, retired from the dealership for 3 years. He had driven in from Plainview that morning with his wife. He found Phyllis in the lobby afterward. He stood in front of her for a moment without saying anything. "Bobby," she said. "Mrs. Granger." He looked at his hands. "I brought the wrong motor in 2001. I mean, it worked. But I should have come in 1992 with the right question instead of waiting 9 years to show up with a used pump part. You came when it mattered, Bobby. The cotton lived. I've thought about those 3 hours in the pump house a great deal." "So have I," she said. "The cotton is still alive." He shook her hand. He shook Aaron's hand. He walked out with his wife into the Lubbock afternoon. Phyllis Granger was 56 years old in 2010. Oscar was gone. Aaron ran the daily operation. The back 40 held 108 pecan trees now, expanded in 2 phases since 2000. 3 Wichita varieties, and a block of western schley that Aaron had added in 2006 for cross-pollination and late-season market diversity. The cotton alleys were on a rotation with a winter wheat cover crop that Aaron had proposed and Phyllis had agreed to after reading the A&M bulletin twice. The combined operation in 2010 was assessed at $2.1 million. The back 40 alone, which had been raw cotton ground valued at $80,000 in 1992, was assessed at $40,000. The full farm had appreciated at 3 times the rate of comparable Hale County cotton operations over the same 18 years. Gerald Mabry had retired in 2005. He wrote Phyllis a letter that year. It was 3 paragraphs. The 3rd paragraph said he had been wrong in 1993, and he hoped the farm was well. She kept the letter in the folder she had labeled Record in 1994. Leland Pruitt retired in 2008. He developed, in his last 3 years at the Farm Bureau office, the county's first crop insurance framework for intercropped orchard systems on irrigated high plains ground. He called it an actuarial gap closure. Phyllis called it overdue. Pete Granger paid off his restructured operating note in 2006. His East 40 acres, now in its 3rd year of pecan production, had contributed enough combined income to close the gap. He told Phyllis at Thanksgiving that year that he had written a check to the bank in full. She said, "I know." He said, "How do you know?" She said, "Gerald Mabry told me when he retired." The farm is still in the family. Aaron manages it. His daughter, who is 8, already walks the pecan rows with her grandmother in the evenings when Phyllis visits, asking questions the same way Phyllis once asked questions at the South Fence in Roswell, pulling at the bark and looking at the soil and asking why the tree grows where it grows and what the roots are doing below the ground, where nobody can see them. Phyllis tells her what her father told her. They are drinking for everybody. That is the whole secret. That is what 63 wooden stakes in a cotton field in July of 1992 were always going to become. If you had learned in 1964 what patient ground and deep roots can do when you stop asking the land to be only one thing and let it be everything it was always capable of being. I keep thinking about that South Fence in Roswell. A 10-year-old girl standing next to her father in August, watching crops go pale all around them and the pecan trees staying dark green. Her father didn't hand her a textbook. He just pointed and said, "The trees are drinking for everybody when there's nothing left in the top ground." That was it. One sentence. And 32 years later, that sentence saved a farm. What Phyllis did wasn't complicated, but it wasn't easy either. It required something most of us don't talk about enough, which is the willingness to act on what you know is true, even when everyone around you is certain you're wrong. That's not stubbornness. Stubbornness is holding a position because you can't stand to lose. What Phyllis had was different. She had done the reading. She had the folder. She had the A&M bulletins and the letters from researchers and the soil survey maps. When Gerald Mabry leaned back in that chair in 1993 and used his banker's silence to push her toward doubt, she didn't flinch because she wasn't working from a feeling. She was working from knowledge she had earned. That's what I think about when people talk about being smart. It's not being the quickest in the room. It's doing the work before the room gets quiet and staring you down. But knowledge alone doesn't hold a farm through 11 years of a community deciding you're wrong. The drought of 2002 didn't care that Phyllis had a folder of research papers. The pump failure in 2001 didn't care that her projections were sound. What got her through those years was something closer to the bone than intelligence. It was the decision, made quietly and not announced to anyone, that she was going to keep going. That she was going to drive herself to the pump house at 5:30 in the morning and figure it out and not stop. I think about those 10 weeks after Oscar's accident, 240 acres and a market garden, and a woman running it alone, boozing 12 pounds she didn't have. There's no word for that in a business book. It just looks like a woman who didn't quit. And then there's what Phyllis did with Pete. That's the part I find hardest to explain to people who weren't there for the first part of the story. Pete had sat at that kitchen table in 1992 and told her 3 times that the trees would cost her the place. He had come to her after Ray's funeral and suggested in family language that the land ought to come back to Whitlock hands. And in 2003, when the drought had broken him and the bank had him in a restructure, Phyllis offered him a partnership, not because she owed him, not because it made the easiest financial sense, because Ray would have wanted his brother's land kept whole, because she didn't believe in neighbors who didn't make it. I've thought about that a long time, what it takes to sit across a table from someone who underestimated you for a decade and offer them a hand up without making them feel the weight of what you're not saying. That's not weakness. That's a kind of strength that most of us are still working toward. The cause was 63 trees in July of 1992. The effect was a farm worth 4 times its conventional value in 2010. A brother-in-law who stayed on the land, and a granddaughter learning to read soil at the south fence the same way Phyllis learned it in Roswell. Every piece of that came from one woman who learned something at age 10, held it for 3 decades, and then put it in the ground. The trees were drinking for everybody. She just had to be the one willing to plant them.